For this final digital story, I wanted to start with reflecting on my personal use of technology. Um, I use Google and Microsoft a lot, but I've learned a lot more about organizing it and what resources are available within Google and Microsoft. Also learning how to use YouTube to upload videos and then use that to upload to like Canvas. The biggest thing that I use right now is Canva. I've used it, I learned about it in this course from one of my peers, and I but I've used it in other classes now. And then I actually also I tutor student athletes on campus, and I've had multiple students that were doing presentations and they needed to do a voiceover, but like PowerPoint wasn't working correctly for them and they kind of got stuck and they got really worried. They weren't sure what to do, and I was able to introduce them to Canva, and so I was able to use like what I have learned in this course with a student, which was really, or with multiple students, which was really cool. So based on the feedback that I got from my previous digital stories, one thing that I just mentioned was that I learned how to use Canva to record my presentations. I didn't know that you could do that. Um, and then another question I got on one of them was, how do you record the talking head? So you use Canva to do that, and then when you're recording, you can choose to just, it says like record talking head, and so that's how I do it. I just use Canva and I just have the free version. I had a lot of feedback on the apps and resources that I provided in my digital stories. Some of the ones that seemed to be the most liked or appreciated, or like that I had the most comments about, were the Newhouse Center, using VR, book clubs, and then using ebooks with students, and the digital storytelling with young students, that you can do it as young as kindergarten. Obviously, it's a lot more scaffolded, but that it's possible to help students tell their story of who they are, and you can use it like at the beginning of a school year to introduce students. Someone was talking about Sketch Engine, and shared that they felt like, because in one of my previous digital stories, it talked about Sketch Engine, but that you do have to pay for the subscription. I was kind of debating if it was worth it or not, and one of my peers said that they have used it previously and that they felt like it was totally worth the subscription. So that's just something to think about as we go further into our program or careers. Scratch, someone asked what Scratch was. Scratch is an online program with coding, and so students can use codes to create things within Scratch. I highly recommend it. It's free, or at least there's at least a free version. And I had students that if we had like indoor recess, that's what they chose to do, and they didn't realize it was academic, but then they would come talk to me about the codes they created to use within this game program. Another thing that I learned was I got kind of confused on gamified versus gamification, and so I kind of thought that Kahoot and like quizzes and Blooket were more gamified, but one of my peers shared that they felt like it was more gamification, because you're learning the information in a lesson and then applying that information in this game kind of quiz kind of program. That helped me a lot to understand the difference, because they seemed really similar to me, and so I just kind of got confused on which one was which. And how do you identify it? Another thing was just thinking about the awareness of students when they're using technology. Technology can be such a great resource to motivate students, to engage students, and to teach content. And like with this SAMR model, making some things that would not be accessible. But we do also have to be aware that students may feel frustrated, and that they may feel so much frustration that it defeats the purpose of the technology. And so we need to make sure that we are adjusting as needed when we're using technology with students. One question that I was asked was how to manage VR in a classroom setting. I also had this question, but one of my thoughts was when we're using VR, because you're not going to have, if you have 30 students, you're going to have 30 VR headsets. So if I were to do it, I would want to probably, at least at first, incorporate it into a lesson that was multi-days, so that students had, like, so you have just groupings for small groups that go and use the VR headsets, and then like once they've done it, then like the next group goes. And so if you have shorter like blocks or periods, then this is going to take multiple days, so you have to kind of decide, is it worth it? But if it is, you could split them into smaller groups, and have very explicit expectations set up at the very beginning, so students know if they're not meeting those expectations, they lose that privilege, and that the VR program is a privilege. It's not just something that's guaranteed. So, and then another question that I was asked was my thoughts on leveraging the use of technology to promote students' motivation in language learning and reading. I have done this a little bit. So, one way that I used technology with a student that was, I'll give two examples. One was with a language learner, and they did not have motivation to read because they really struggled. They didn't really love reading in their home language, and then in English it was so much harder. And so and it was hard for them to get engaged. And so one thing that I did was to use technology to find like ebooks, so that they could, one, they had the opportunity to listen to them if they wanted to, but then they also had more options than just like what my classroom library gave them for ideas. And I just had lots of different leveled reading, and so students could decide what they were interested in. And it wasn't necessarily their, like, if it was lower than their like academic reading level, sometimes my focus with students was motivation and engagement, not necessarily reading to your ability level. And then with reading, I had a student that really, really struggled to read. He had multiple learning disabilities in reading. And again, I used ebooks because he was able to, well, I used audiobooks with him, because I realized that he loved, I did a read aloud every day, and he loved the read aloud. He would sit on the edge of his seat and he'd ask all these questions, and he was so excited. And so I used that information to then introduce him to audiobooks, and he would listen to stories, and he found out that he loved historical fiction, but he never would have known that. He didn't know that until he started listening to them, and he realized that he could listen to a story and he would close his eyes and he would just use imagery, and he would be able to tell you everything that the author had written in that chapter or within that book at the end. And he would go home and tell his parents about it. And I taught him for, I think, 2 years in a row. And so by the end of the second year, he actually had progressed a lot in his reading ability as well. And so he was able to read, and so more books. And so he started actually getting into like physically reading. But at first, to get him motivated into literacy, audiobooks was a great source for him. Finally, the last question that I was asked was the feedback from my previous digital stories was to provide an explanation of Act to Speak, GymKit, and quizzes. So GymKit is sort of similar to Kahoot. So it's like a sort of game show style, sort of Family Feud-ish, and you create these quizzes essentially, but in a game show style. Act to Speak is where students can, it actually was originally used with speech therapists, if I'm remembering correctly and understanding the literature on it, but that it ended up being used in education classrooms for students, especially language learning students, to practice their English language skills. And then quizzes is where you can create quizzes for your students, and then they can do them online. And there's lots of different options for what type of quiz you want to create and what kind of questions you want to ask. I really enjoyed this course, and I really appreciate you taking the time to watch my final digital story, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thanks.